And we will continue with another point of view about someone who knows a lot about APIs as a product, which is Derric Gilling, CEO of Moesif. Hello, Derric. How are you?
Doing good. Thanks for having me here today.
So let's talk about how to monetize and productize your APIs right now.
Awesome. Yeah, just a little bit about myself. I'm the CEO of Moesif, the leading API analytics and monetization platform. I love helping API first businesses trying to figure out the PLG side of things around monetizing APIs, developing usage-based pricing. And if you're ever in San Francisco, I love IPAs. So you can find me at Zeitgeist and a couple of local bars there. Always hit me up. Here's my email. So why are we talking about monetizing and productizing APIs? Well, selling traditional SaaS is much harder today than it was 5 or 10 years ago. Traditionally, folks would sign up for a SaaS tool for their team. Maybe it's 20 or 30 or even hundreds of different developers and end users to perform different manual tasks, whether it's project management, leveraging their CRM, that type of stuff. But today, customer requirements have changed drastically. They're looking for automation. They're trying to leverage AI, especially in 2023. They're trying to become much more efficient at the process. So what used to take 20 people can now be done by a single developer just through an API. And so a lot of that value is also being transferred through APIs rather than a traditional UI. Lastly, these different customers are looking for targeted solutions. What used to be a one-stop shop for all the different processes that were required at a business through a UI are now becoming piecemealed. And so you can actually think of APIs as Legos and pick and choose the solution that makes the most sense for the business. But there's another trend that's been happening, right? The buying power is shifting more and more towards individual developers. So if you look at circa 2003, for example, the only people that were really purchasing software was a C-suite. And that's because to deploy that type of on-prem expensive software, it took a lot of investment and a lot of planning. And so that was traditionally deployed throughout the entire organization. When we look at 2013, which was what I consider peak SaaS, that shifted towards department heads, team leads. They could pick the tools that they wanted for their particular use case and for their team. But again, with the peak API in 2023, what we see is, this has accelerated drastically where a single developer can pick the solution that they want and go and adopt it. And so today, we're actually going to talk about how do you actually productize these APIs and turn them into revenue and profit centers for the business. And notice here, I have a timeline, which are all the different stages as you think about productizing APIs. The bottom half here are different engineering concerns, building, publishing, serving. But there's a lot of other business concerns, which are on the top half here. How do you figure out the right business strategy, architect? And then how do you define the right KPIs to measure against? And lastly, do you iterate, do you deprecate, and how do you manage that process? So let's first just jump into the business strategy itself, which a lot of this is around pricing and packaging. But each API business is different. So you have to figure out what to charge for, how do you actually invoice your customers, is it prepaid versus postpaid billing, and how do you package that into a solution that's easy to understand for customers. So let's just first talk about what to charge. There's a lot of different metrics to look for when figuring out usage-based pricing and metering for your APIs. There's things like transaction volume, for Cinch or Twilio, that might be number of text messages, number of faxes being sent. The typical case with Stripe is a revenue or cost share, where they take 2.9% of every invoice. We have other use cases like Datadog, which will charge a number of gigabytes or number of log lines. We also have user-centric pricing schemes, such as Segment, where they price in monthly active users, and lastly, resource-based, which we see a lot within infrastructure and the cloud vendors, things like Amazon Redshift, Snowflake. We're actually charging a number of compute hours, or maybe it's number of VM hours. But notice for every single one of these, we're looking at customer value. We're not just charging on API calls. So those are not necessarily one and the same. The example here would be, there's a lot of API calls that might fail. You might have a batch endpoint where if your platform is text messaging platform, you might be able to actually batch and send 100 text messages in a single API call. And so how do you actually figure out first the billing strategy that works for your customers? And there's two common billing strategies. One is prepaid billing, one is postpaid billing. When you look at prepaid billing, the customer is actually committing to some type of credits or quota ahead of time before they even consume your API. So this is great for cash flow for your business, especially if you're just starting out. It's a brand new project at your company. Maybe you're trying to bootstrap a startup, so you can actually generate cash directly even before your customers using those APIs. It's also a lot more familiar with enterprise, because this is what traditional SaaS pricing looked like. You'd subscribe for a particular plan, and then use that plan for the next year or a couple of years, whatever that contract was defined for. But there can be a lot of friction created by trying to figure out how much usage I should subscribe for if I don't even know the usage in the first place, especially if this is a brand new project or solution. And it can also be much harder for pay-as-you-go, because again, now you're asking for a customer to commit to something that they don't even know what they're going to need. And so this is where postpaid can actually be really handy, because now you can allow a customer to sign up and start using their service or your service without understanding these things. So it can make pay-as-you-go a lot easier. But one of the tricky things is it can be abused. So especially if you have very high cost vendors that you depend on to serve that API, then you might want to rethink whether postpaid makes sense. The other thing to think about is, how do you actually package your APIs to make sense from a customer standpoint? And there are two different ways, again, to think about packaging. One is a tiered pricing model, which we see a lot borrowed from the traditional SaaS world, where you have a good, a better, and a best plan. You also have pay-as-you-go, which is sometimes called consumption-based pricing or usage-based pricing. One of the great things with tiered pricing is it can enforce a minimum spend. So this can be really helpful, especially if you have very high support costs and you don't want to manage a very large number of low-paying or low ACV customers. It's also much more predictable for customers. They know roughly what they're going to spend each month or each quarter or each year. And it's much easier to implement, especially if there's no usage-based component at all. You can have a very fixed quota, very well-defined set of features that they can be subscribed to. So super simple to get the first MVP out the door. But one of the hardest things to deal with tiered pricing is you have friction in expansion itself. It's very rigid. An example is, let's say a developer signs up for the $100 a month plan, but they see $300 a month in value from your API. That means that delta is now $200, right? Because their perceived value is much higher than what they're spending. But let's say your next plan, it jumps all the way up to $500, right? And so right now they're still getting $300 in value. So they need to actually go above 500 before it really makes sense for them to spend that $500 a month. And so that's one of the hardest things with tiered pricing that is solved with pay-as-you-go. With pay-as-you-go, the customer gets to spend only what they need and what they consume, nothing more. So it's a much more efficient for the customer, and it can appear a lot cheaper from a pricing standpoint. But one of the hardest things here, though, is going to be a lot harder to implement. Now you need very accurate metering, especially when you think about, gap accounting and when it was consumed, and what if, it rolls over into the next month. You need to make sure it's audit friendly. So a lot of moving pieces when you implement some type of pay-as-you-go model. The other big concern is you can surprise customers with billing surprises. For example, let's say the developer signs up for $50 a month, but they just blow through their usage really rapidly. They deploy their integration to production, and suddenly they get a $10,000 bill. No one wants to explain that to your manager, right? Like, no one wants to say, oh gosh, I just spent $10,000 on this tool. So how do you manage customer expectations so they're not surprised? Lastly, around invoicing, this is more of a financial concern versus a product engineering concern, but it does impact your customers. And so the two popular models is recurring and threshold based. Recurring is more familiar, again, with the SaaS world. It's predictable for customers, and it's also easier for your finance team, because now you can recognize that revenue each month, each quarter, each year. You know exactly when it was consumed. However, it can have bad unit economics, especially for low-cost SaaS and APIs. So for example, let's say you're using Amazon S3, you can actually get started paying a couple pennies. But does it actually make sense to send a monthly invoice for 5 cents when that's all the usage they had? It can also be very complex for prepaid. And this goes back to that pay-as-you-go piece I mentioned earlier. So this is where threshold can be really helpful. And this was popularized by the ad tech industry. If you use something like Google AdWords, they have actually a threshold where they won't invoice you until you reach, certain number of dollars in spend. Twilio is another example of this, but on the prepaid side, where you can actually purchase a number of credits and can use those credits in the next month, next quarter. It doesn't really matter. It can actually just roll over and you just keep burning those credits. And so the nice thing with threshold based is it reduces the transaction costs from a financial standpoint and a lot of the overhead with dealing with invoices. However, one of the hardest things to deal with is the revenue recognition piece, because now you purchase, $50 worth of Twilio credits. You can use some of them this month, maybe some of them the next, 2 weeks of the next month. So you have these weird boundaries that you have to now figure out. Another thing is now technically a company liability on the balance sheet, because now you have customers that have outstanding credits. So you have to now handle that appropriately. So we talked a lot about pricing and trying to figure out the right business strategy around the APIs. But now let's talk about how do you actually grow it and turn this truly into a growing API product. And one thing to keep in mind is developers need buy-in from many stakeholders. So we mentioned earlier, that the buying power has been shifting to end users and developers. But that's not the end game here, right? It's great to get a developer to use a product. But there's a lot of other things happening behind the scenes. And so they are probably researching your solution because, the executive team, VPs have mentioned this as a project priority or a company priority. But again, there's still legal and security review to think about, changing project priorities, financial procurement concerns, a lot of other missing pieces before that developer can really start paying for your API, get it through procurement, and get everything rolled out to production. So how do you accelerate this? Well, you can actually implement a self-service sign-up model. So this is part of the whole, PLG, product-led growth thing that we keep seeing over and over, but it works really well for API products because that developer, even though they get to decide the tool that they want, it's not just their decision. But by allowing things like click-through terms of service and super simple, quick integration processes that might take only 15 minutes, they can get up and running. And they can start paying a token amount just on a manager's credit card rather than waiting 30 or 60 or whatever, how many days it takes to get through procurement. And so what we're trying to do here is land a lot of developers and just have them see a lot of value in the API. Get them to share the integration or the application with their colleagues, with their manager. Get them to show something. Hey, this is something cool. Now I need to keep investing more into this platform to get that MVP, that little POC into a full working solution. But because they're already to see that value, now they have buy-in from their leadership team, from their manager to continue to invest. So again, the main focus here is just get them to pay a token amount, whether that's $50 a month, $100 a month, very small amount. But that doesn't mean you're done, right? So the main goal for sales is really to sell through these developers, right? And so you have these users that are already on, these self-service platforms, but what you're trying to figure out is what are enterprise requirements that they have, whether that's security, compliance, legal. They might also have expanding usage, right? Because again, even though that developer signed up, that might only be for a small POC where the usage is very small, just a couple of different test accounts. They're exploring the solution, but once they roll this out to production, the usage might look very, very different. And lastly, they might have a lot of other use cases they want to solve with your API. Because again, APIs are like building blocks, or like Legos. And so even though they're using one API, you might actually have some other APIs that are even more suitable and better and can solve the use case better. And so we like to actually talk about the PLG sales flywheel, where you have a self-service developer user sign up, they get to their aha moment. We call that their first hello world, right? And then they start increasing their usage. But then that's when sales engages, right? Sales engages, and then they continue to identify new use cases, which accelerates that usage, and then sales engages again. And this cycle continues and continues and continues until that $50 a month developer turns into a much larger contract at the organization. But scaling self-service is really hard. There's going to be issues during onboarding. They're going to have questions, around the API. Maybe they're going to have 400 or 500 errors. There's going to be changing business needs, right? Maybe one team was initially using the set of APIs, but now another set of teams also needs to start consuming these APIs. And just like I mentioned earlier, there's going to be billing surprises. There's going to be issues you're going to run into. And so how do you manage that, especially when you have not just 100 accounts to manage, but hundreds of thousands of different developers consuming your APIs? And so the best way to do that is create a great self-service experience. Make everything self-service as much as possible, so that way you are not in the loop. Your support staff is not doing mundane tasks such as adding team members or changing plans, doing simple things. Instead, they can actually focus more on the high value, which is being consultative with your customer base, making sure they get the most value. And so creating these different self-service, whether it's dashboards or so usage, whether it's sending out an email when they're getting closer to quota limits, or maybe their usage spike by a certain percentage, just over communicating so they can manage their account themselves. And this way they can manage it on their own time, even if it's at 2 a.m. And so again, trying to avoid billing surprises by over communicating. So one of the best things you can do is send out emails regularly, depending on where the usage sits. So we talked quite a bit around how to grow your API product and turn that into a revenue center. But now, how do you actually measure that growth? Are you on track, to meet the right goals that you set for this API program? Because at the end of the day, you're investing into your APIs to probably generate revenue. Maybe if it's a partner API, to generate partner relationships. Maybe it's to help increase the amount of features and use cases around your platform. But there are certain goals that you want to define so that you can measure against. And so one thing to keep in mind is treat your API as a product. What that means is you should be looking at product metrics and not necessarily infrastructure metrics. Product metrics are usually aligned to one of these 3 goals. Number 1 is adoption. How many different developers are starting to adopt and use the APIs? The second is engagement. What is the breadth and depth of usage? How many different APIs are they using? And for each API, what does that usage look like? Is it a very small amount? Are they using it a lot? A lot of different end users, that are actually sending transactions through the API. Last but not least is retention, right? And the most important thing here is, are developers sticking around? Are your customers sticking around, or are they leaving because there's maybe issues with the API and they found a better solution? So let's just speak on adoption itself real quick. And so here I actually built out what I consider a healthy adoption funnel for a self-service API product. And there's 3 steps here. There's sign up, which is signing up right on your website or maybe your doc page, which express interest in exploring your API further. And then we have our first hello world. And this is sending that very first API call. That could be through a tool like Postman, a tool like Curl, a lot of different technologies out there. And at that point, the developer, they invested some time to actually explore your API. There's already interest there. There's intent. However, that does not necessarily mean they saw value yet, because sending a single API call through a tool like Postman is very different than a working solution. And that's where we get to this last step, which is your first working app. And there's a couple of different terms for this: first live app, first revenue generating app, first working app. But what you're tracking here is, what are the minimum number of whether it's API calls, transactions, whatever it is that you consider as being healthy and a working solution. So in this case, we're looking at a payments API, and that first hello world is sending the very first API call. We consider this not really a full solution until at least 100 transactions are sent through the application. And there are different ways to measure this, whether it's transaction counts, whether they're using SDK versus using Postman. But again, trying to define that criteria and having a very rigorous set of metrics. The second is engagement. And again, notice here, I don't have API calls. Instead, it's aligned to the customer value that is received. And this could depend on which industry you're in, what the platform is trying to do. So if you're an e-commerce platform, that might mean looking at checkout conversion rate. it might mean number of transactions sold through the platform. If you're a SaaS solution, that API metric might mean a number of different integrations being used, number of different extensions. For data API, it may actually be more tied to the data itself, such as match rate. Was it found in the database? Was it not found? Because if everything was amiss, if nothing was found in your data set, your customers probably didn't have any value or receive any value, even though transactions were still flowing. Lastly, for logistics API, looking at things like successful orders and fulfillment orders, because if that order was not fulfilled, again, no value was actually delivered. Maybe the joke is for airlines, they should actually consider the time sitting on the tarmac versus actually in the air. So I would actually recommend looking at only those 2 hours in the air versus the 10 hours sitting on the tarmac, given everything in New York. Hopefully they hear me. Lastly, looking at retention, how you actually grow and retain your long-term customers. And a good retention curve in this case will sometimes look like a smile or flatten out. What we're measuring here is for each cohort of users or developers that signed up, are they using the API 1 week later, 2 weeks later, and continuing on. And so in this case, we see at week 0, of course, 100% of that cohort was active. But once we get to week 1, we see the largest drop off. In this case, for the enterprise segment, 75% of that cohort is still active, which means we lost 25% of that cohort. But when we look at self-service, it's even worse, right? We only have 38% of that cohort still active. They're still doing things with the API. So there is a big drop off here. This is still considered healthy retention because it flattens out. Once we get to week 8, we still see around 36% of our self-service users are active. And in fact, we actually see that by week 8, it actually jumped up a little bit at 83% because we pulled back some folks who maybe stopped using in week 1 because they're waiting on procurement or whatever it is that they're waiting on. But in this case, this is a healthy retention curve. Instead, if these two curves went down to 0 or close to 0, that means, and that tells me I need to focus on the product itself before I continue to invest in adoption and marketing and sales and everything else, because people are just not sticking around. Some people might call that a leaky boat. And so the main goal here is that infrastructure metrics are aligned to engineering goals, but not necessarily product goals, things like uptime, SLAs, performance. So when you start defining those metrics, make sure they're aligned back to adoption, usage, or engagement and retention. The last thing I want to mention is, how do you manage end of life? Do you iterate? Do you deprecate? And this is going to be a tricky decision to make, and it depends on engineering resources at hand, what the revenue or the growth or number of partners that are being driven through the platform, what those engagement metrics look like. But eventually, you're going to have to make a call. And the biggest thing we recommend is make sure, if you do decide to sunset or deprecate an API, handle it gracefully. Make sure you over communicate rather than under communicate, whether that's through email, whether that's through notifications and other things. A little bit about ourselves. Sorry, little plug here. We're Moesif. We help with a lot of these things: product analytics, user-based billing, and guidance. Any questions?
Yeah, one question, Derric. There is a saying which is, don't think the best business model for your APIs, but what are the best APIs for your business model? And you show many examples here about different strategy, but do you agree with that statement?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
No, the question is, there is a statement sometimes shared which is, don't think what are the best business model for your APIs, but what are the best APIs for your business model? So does that talk to you?
I've never actually heard that term before, but it does somewhat resonate in that you're actually trying to find a business solution, right? But at the same time, you have to align it to the API itself, right? And so if I'm looking for let's say a text messaging API, there might be one that's self-service. There might be one where I can't actually sign up at all. And so I'm going to start trying to figure out on my own time, should I start using this API? And I'm going to look at their documentation, I'm going to look at what their sign-up process looks like. I'm going to look at how much investment does it take before I even see some value from the platform.
Yeah, and I really like your slide on the KPIs for APIs, as John Messer used to call them. But the right APIs, having the right success metrics is extremely important. There is also one question about on the pricing. You show that the time to first the sign up, the hello world, the working app, the mindful at least metrics to define a really active whatever developer. But the thing is you're trying to have full self-service. So sometimes, you will put a bar where actually people will leave because they're just below the bar, right? Below the pricing or the feature. How can you, it's really a SaaS business model at some point, but at scale, what advice could you give to really understand the user, and really make what will make people adopt it versus go away?
Sure. One of the biggest things I always recommend is allow a new developer to pick their journey. Right? Especially for, if self-service doesn't work for your business because there's regulatory concerns, maybe there's just a lot of setup process, and it's perfectly fine to have a more sales-led or customer success-led motion, to drive adoption, but allow them to take that path, but then allow maybe developers can also get started in a test environment that doesn't have any production data. And so a good example of this would be a company like Stripe and a lot of different financial companies where you cannot deploy that API to production without signing a lot of agreements, but Stripe still allows you to sign up for a test account, right? And so, so what you want to do is on your website, you're going to have, hey, I'm a developer, I can sign up, get started, but if I need to talk to sales, I need some help, make sure you give them a path. Don't force them to do self-service if that's not going to work well.
Perfect, Derric. Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Any other questions?
No other questions from the chat. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, and hopefully everyone has a great rest of their day here at API Days.